Thank you, Anthony.
Okay, now we'll go to
Can
the
you hear
casual
me?
section.
Okay. You are the first one in your family to attend high school. It appears there wasn't much in your background that would have led you to your current path. Can you point to a transitional experience that made a difference in your life?
You know, neither my mom or my dad is alive any longer, so I think about them a lot. And I remember my mom always she hated my official bio. She's like, Antonio, why do they have to say you're the first openly gay Puerto Rican man head of the ACLU? Because I am. She goes, yeah, but, could they just put that in the first press release? And she goes, why do they say that, you're the first in your family to graduate from high school? I'm like, because I am. I know, but she was a little bit embarrassed by not being a high school graduate. And I kept saying to her, which I think she finally understood, was that it was a real testament to my parents about how they raised us with a sense of optimism and a sense of can-do, that it was really a tribute to where we came from. And it was really a tribute to her as mom and my father, both that allowed my sister and myself both to be college graduates. My sister's a social worker, so the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And that they both had kids who succeeded, but also are committed to social justice. And I think the only thing that I can point to in a moment in my early life that kind of took me down a different path, because there was no one in my family who had ever been a lawyer. Everyone had been a waiter or a doorman. My uncle was a doorman, my uncle was a cab driver, my father was a janitor, and then became a waiter. But my father, before becoming a waiter, was a janitor at a hotel, and he wanted to become a waiter, and they turned him down for the job because they said his English wasn't good enough, which is maybe partly accurate. But as my father would describe, when you're a banquet waiter, which is what he became, you didn't really need a lot of English because everybody got chicken. So it was coffee or tea, right? It was just, that's all the English you needed. And he filed a union grievance to get the job as a waiter. And then when he got the job, we were able to leave public housing projects in the Bronx where we had grown up. We got our first car. I got my first stereo. My mother got a brand new living room set. My father and my mother stopped arguing over money. Life became easier for us. There was less stress over money. We took our first and our only family vacation to Disney World. And I remember it was that one lawyer who just totally changed the trajectory of my father's career at the hotel and my whole family, right? And if we had not left the housing projects in the Bronx when we did, maybe my life circumstances would have been very different. I'm sure they would have been, my sister's life circumstances would have been different. And so that really kind of stuck with me. And so I thought, a lawyer did someone a lot of good in my family, and a lawyer I never met. His name was Vito Pita. I remember my father kind of worshipped this guy because he was my father's advocate. I've been in touch with his grandson now, because I've talked about this once, and his grandson found me and wrote me a letter. I'm like, I'm Vito Pita Jr. I'm like, oh, thank you. Your grandfather saved my ass. But it just, I think, is the one thing that, if anything, helped me understand about the power of advocacy and law, and that people's lives are touched that you may never know. And it's true for you as lawyers or for young activists, as donors and supporters. Your contributions allow people and organizations like Planned Parenthood and the ACLU to make a difference on people's lives that you will never know. And I think that is part of the magic of the work we do.
America is the most diverse nation in the world. Why do you think our Constitution works?
You know, I think it works partly because it's an evolving document. It's certainly imperfect. And there are things that I wish were recognized in the Constitution that would make a material difference in people's lives. Like it's not just the civil and political rights, but it's also dealing with kind of some of the more material circumstances, the right to health, the right to housing. I take a more expansive view of what being free in America is. It's not just freedom from discrimination or freedom from government intrusion, but it's also freedom from want and freedom. But some of that is not yet part of the way we view the Constitution or our constitutional jurisprudence. It may evolve to that over time. I mean, certainly when you think about, and when I say this, sometimes some of my own members take issue with me because it's, where's the civil liberties in blank? And, you know, how is the Affordable Care Act a civil liberties issue? So the way I answer in my mind is that there was, before the Affordable Care Act was signed into law, there really was no right to health coverage. But we created a statutory right, under the Affordable Care Act that would give people access to health insurance. And now having provided a statutory framework that gave people access to health insurance, the conscious effort to repeal access to health insurance is a civil rights, civil liberties issue. You know, it didn't exist before the Affordable Care Act, but having created it statutorily, and those of us who are lawyers don't only think it's not that the only right that you have is something that emanates directly from the Constitution. We have a whole bunch of rights that come directly out of statutes. And that's why I think the place where I take hope is in the kind of continuing evolution of the law. And certainly when you look at things like LGBT rights, the march, we may be having some setbacks, and we certainly have, our opponents are doubling down. But when you look at how far we've come in what period of time, I get encouraged.
Anthony, earlier today, you expressed pessimism that Congress would support DACA and the Dreamers.
Yeah.
Why do you feel that way? And if indeed they do not support DACA and the Dreamers, what kind of a moment does that create in America?
I hope I'm wrong. I mean, as you can tell already, I prepare for the worst, and I hope for the best. It's not that, so I hope Congress can get its act together to pass a clean DREAM Act that doesn't overload the kind of the remedy to Dreamers with border enforcement or scaled up deportation efforts. I think that, you know, it's a devil with it's a devil's bargain if they say the only way you're going to get a pathway for the Dreamers to remain is to kind of scale up the detention deportation efforts. So I hope I'm wrong. I think this Congress is fundamentally, I mean, I'm not saying anything that's not news to you. It's dysfunctional, right? And I don't see them becoming functional anytime soon. I mean, I spend too much time in Washington, and I talk to too many people whose job it is to legislate, and it seems like we can't find our way to doing that. And so I actually think that this will be one of those kind of moments when, just like we saw with the Muslim ban, or just like we saw, there will be a kind of spontaneous citizen engagement that will really put a fine point on what's playing out in this country. And I think it will be a moment of conscience for not just the elected officials, but for employers and for men and women of goodwill, regardless of the party. And I think it would just be one of those moments when the pressure that will have to be applied to fix this one way or the other, to force this president to, he says he loves the Dreamers, and he gave Congress, 6 months to fix it. If they don't fix it, well then guess what, Mr. President? You have executive power. And only you are the impediment to your fixing it. Right? And if you say you believe in these Dreamers, let's call the question then. And I think there is another avenue then directly to him. He alleges that he believes in these young folk, the 800,000 Dreamers. And if not, then let's denude the man of any claim to civility or to support for the Dreamers. And I think there will come a moment, and I think that part of what's really exciting is watching the Dreamer movement is one of the most vibrant social movements in all of our areas. It's just they are energetic, they're dynamic, they don't take any prisoners, they don't take orders from us, certainly not from me. These folks are on their own, and I'm just interested to see where they take me, right? Because I am signing up for their leadership and their agency in this struggle. And where we end up, I think, will be critically important, not just for them, but for the country.
Harris County has the second largest Hispanic population in the U.S., just behind Los Angeles. Authorities here say they do not assist the federal government in enforcing immigration law.
Yeah.
Therefore, Houston has been termed a so-called sanctuary city.
Yeah.
In sanctuary cities, how do local enforcement practices actually play out? And what have been ACLU responses on this front?
I think I think there's still probably ways to improve further about how to ensure that Harris County and the city of Houston and some of the other large jurisdictions can be more protective of immigrants' rights. It's one thing to say that we're not going to actively collude with the federal government and the Department of Homeland Security and detention deportation efforts. It's another thing to really create a feeling of sanctuary and support. So I think part of what's interesting here is watching how this whole, it's really kind of, we live in such, you got to remember Molly Ivins, you have to have fun. You have to chuckle to yourself, right? What's good for the goose is good for the gander. And I just love being able to use states' rights arguments against this administration. And it's just like, it's an argument. It worked, right? How can you threaten local jurisdictions with the repeal of government monies that have nothing to do with immigration enforcement? It'd be very different if they were going to withhold money on immigration issues, right? Because it's within the same channel, if you will. But you don't get to hold back Department of Transportation, Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Justice, Department of Education money for the immigration issue. You can't hold jurisdictions hostage because you don't like what they do on one issue from these other panoply of federal programs. And this is part of the beauty of this system of, of federalism that we've got, right? And certainly, it is what what the Republicans did with President Obama was to exploit the system of states' rights and federalist arguments to oppose those parts of the policies and laws that they disagreed with. Well, welcome to our America. Guess what? We've got some of the same issues with you all, and we've been actively playing that game on both the sanctuary city laws, on the Muslim ban, and I think it's going to be quite interesting for them to understand that there are jurisdictions that can push this discussion in ways they had never envisioned, and that's why I think work coming out of places like Harris County or Santa Clara or San Francisco and sanctuary cities, or the states of Hawaii or Washington State on the Muslim ban, is a whole new, exciting frontier for how we think about rights and liberties, understanding the limits of a limited federal government and the expansive powers delegated to the state governments. And so I think it actually creates a great deal of energy. I think also one thing to be clear about, I mean, part of our challenge in fighting off the Trump administration is to pepper them with as many lawsuits as we possibly can on as many issues as we can, right? And there are cameras in the room, this is not a state secret, right? Right? If you can bog them down in litigation, right? Litigation is our friend because it preserves the status quo. It takes time. It helps shape the public debate, right? So you can take sometimes esoteric issues and you can shape it so that people understand what's going on here, right? Why is someone's rights being violated, right? It's a wonderful way to kind of take complicated policy issues and make them come alive in a real story. And with enough vigor and volume, you can actually ball them up, right? We have filed over 103 legal actions, 56 federal lawsuits since Trump took over. That's more than one federal lawsuit per week, right? And if you can rob them of momentum, if you can rob them of energy to go on the next thing on the to-do list, and so far so good. I mean, we filed more than 24 different Muslim ban lawsuits. We probably could have stopped after 3 or 4. We've done it to 24. Let's make them miserable, right? Let's make them answer every one of these lawsuits, some individual cases, some class action cases, different jurisdictions. Let's split the circuits. Let's make it very hard for the Justice Department lawyers to figure out which case they're arguing where. And then if we're everywhere, we make it harder for them to implement their policies. And I mean, part of it is just kind of, is a conscious effort to resist the efforts of the government to just push through or trammel their policy initiatives. And I think it's fantastically fun. I gotta tell you, it's just very invigorating. When they say to me, "We have another suit for you," I'm like, yes. That I changed. I do have another tally. It's not a digital tally, but I have my kind of worksheet about how many lawsuits have we filed where, and I can break them down for you, all the different issue areas.
Just a couple more questions.
Sure, go for it.
After Sutherland Springs, Texas, and the tragedy there, I have to ask you about what kind of approach do we need to address our gun control issues while protecting the Second Amendment?
So we've taken the position, which sometimes makes us, it makes it challenging for places like Texas or elsewhere, that we believe that whether you believe it's an individual or collective right to bear arms, that's kind of the point is kind of moot at the moment, that the government has an affirmative obligation to ensure public safety, and that reasonable limits on firearms are acceptable from a civil liberties perspective. We don't take the Gun Owners of America viewpoint. And so just like you regulate alcohol or tobacco or firearms, that it is a reasonable limit on either an individual or collective right. That's kind of beside the point, is what is the government's affirmative obligation. Whether or not this government or governments have the political will to implement that type of regulation in the public interest, it seems not. And I think it's one of the, it's one of the places where there's this incredible disconnect between a public understanding and public support when you actually look at the data on what most Americans believe in terms of the regulations on firearms. The public support is there. It's that the elected officials are not there. And that has everything to do with the corrupting influence of money in the political system. The role of the NRA that actually wields more fear than power, but the fear is still quite a cudgel. And ultimately, there will have to come a moment when we break through on those set of issues. It's not a place where we're spending a great deal of our energy, to be totally candid. And in a room full of supporters like you all, sometimes I get the question, well, why aren't you doing more on gun control? And I say, look, this is a place where there are groups that only do gun control, whether you're for the NRA or whether you're for the gun control side of the Brady campaign or Everytown. We've got the First, the Fourth, the Fifth, the 14th Amendments. That's a lot. So I will leave to all the other big gun control groups to focus on the second. And even though we are with them in spirit, it's not a place of a lot of depth for our own advocacy or work.
I'd like to go back to young people for the last question.
Go for it.
I do see lots of young people in my meetings with the ACLU.
Yeah.
In your public outreach campaign, what are you doing that others aren't, that you're attracting so many young people? And what are your national priorities for volunteers?
Yeah. I think it's very exciting when we think about how it's just the demographics of the organization have changed. And it's been a conscious effort for some time. We've launched recently, Henry will tell you in the front row, we launched a summer institute for high school students where we take high school students from across the country and they apply and we bring them to Washington, D.C. for civil liberties camp. So instead of going to tennis camp or math camp or sailing camp, you send them to our camp and we send you back a radical. And we had a couple hundred in the first class where we had one of our graduates in the audience there. Remind me your name again? Martha. And then when we thought we were doing well by doubling the class in the following year, Henry's year. And in fact, we were flooded with applications where we took them all, 550 plus, right? So we doubled the doubled number. I think next year we probably will have 1,000 or so is the goal, over 1,000. These are young people who come from all across, all 50 states. They're high school sophomores and juniors, entering sophomores and juniors. 1/3 of all of our students are on full scholarship, which means that we provide full freight, their travel, their room and board, their curriculum. For those parents who can pay, we charge the parents who can pay, and then we grant scholarships to the kids who can't. And we want to make sure we have a robust community of people. And then we connect them to each other going forward. And, what does this turn out other than wonderful, committed activists who turn up for an event? It's believing in the future. And it's not a lawsuit, and it's not kind of a press release, and it's not something you can immediately point to, but I have every belief that what we invest in these young folks is going to pay dividends long after we've done anything to help them directly. Most recently, we have launched an online platform for offline activism. So with our membership quadrupling and the average age coming more than half, the only way to reach large-scale numbers of people is by using technology. The good old days of having a Saul Alinsky forum where you can have an organizer in front of a room of 20 people and then sending them out to organize, it's just, you'll never get to scale in the way that you want to. So we created this thing called the People Power Platform, where you enter all your data into the portal, and then it sends you out, it spits you out into kind of a resistance training, where you get sent to a house party where the information's web streamed to you and information is sent to you by mail, and you meet other like-minded activists who sign up to help move a real policy issue forward in their local community. And so the first push was on enacting more sanctuary city laws. And we had some pretty remarkable success. We were able to make Phoenix a sanctuary city jurisdiction. Phoenix, Arizona. And in real time, we launched that in January. And, in Trump's America, Phoenix became a sanctuary city jurisdiction. Now we've launched a second push looking at voting rights. So that state by state, we have identified what is the one thing, if we can fix on our voting system in that particular state, that would make a difference. In some states, it's about re-enfranchising former felons, like the work I described in Florida. In some states, it's about dealing with the partisan gerrymandering and how the parties all use the system to disadvantage their opponents and maybe pulling them out into nonpartisan redistricting commissions. In some places, it's just some voter reform efforts by having people try to push through vote by mail or same-day voter registration. In some states, it's about vote dilution statutes, like the ones we were talking about here in Texas. And so each state has its one target, and then you unleash the power of people onto local elected officials. And it's sometimes a little bit messy. Volunteers are harder to control than staff, and staff are pretty hard to control at the ACLU. But volunteers bring such energy, and if we try to control it, we're not thinking big enough. And we'd be really remiss. I think we would be falling down on the job right now if we didn't find a way to tap what's in the water and to unleash greater energy and fervor, and to give people the tools, the directions, the camaraderie, the way to make a difference and influence the local politics. I think we would be we would be committing malpractice if we didn't find a way to try to bottle that energy. And I think the more that you can feed people's ability to make a difference, the more likely they're going to come back saying, now what? Now what can I do for you? And then you can send them out again. And so it becomes this virtuous cycle of taking people and deploying them and then redeploying them and giving them a sense that they've accomplished something is really quite something. I think we're closing up soon?
Yes.
Okay. So the only two things that give me shivers, right? The only two things that really depress me at this time is when I sense or I feel or I smell fatalism and cynicism. Fatalism, what does it matter? It's all gone to hell in a handbasket. What can we do? We'll just wait 3 years or 7 more years, right? Kind of that sense of fatalism. It's just like nothing we can do. And that cynicism is like, what does it matter? Right? Does it really matter? Oh my God, those two things are our real enemies. Right? Become fatalistic or cynical, then we're really lost. Everything else is up for us to grab. And the two things that we've got to find a way to kind of make sure we fight, and which is why the work with young people and the work with volunteers is so critical, because those are the two inoculations, if you will, to cynicism and fatalism, because they will be the end of us. Everything else, we're good to go. Thank you for tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. There you go, Anthony.
Okay.
Thank you for an
very
important,
much. You're all very
very
kind.
important evening, and you've been a wonderful audience. Good to be with you again.
Thank you
Thanks
very
so much.
Bye-bye.